few weeks since we've all been together for various reasons, but you've got the entire all-star panel back together today, and we are excited to be here. So I know we've got a great episode. We got several things that we want to talk about, and my guess is several of those items are going to actually lead us into other discussions. So with that said, let me welcome Stephanie, Paul, Scott, Terry, and Christine in no particular order. Hello. Nobody wants to say hello?
Good morning.
Oh, good morning.
I waved.
Hi.
I waved.
Good morning.
It's morning where I
Good
am.
morning.
Scott is.
I know I do know it's a Monday and we're all coming out of that weekend brain fog, but here we are and we are excited to be live with everybody on this fantastic Monday. All
I
right.
think we're just excited to get to the topics today because they are such passionate topics for us.
We are. And, you know, towards the end, if time permits, Christine, I want to talk to you about an email that you sent to everybody this morning because I think it's an interesting one. And I think it's one that staff who have the ability to connect with their providers and give them feedback, this may be something that you want to share with your providers. So we'll get to that at the end if time permits. But we're going to start with Terry this morning, and we're going to talk about physician disclaimers. So let me start there.
Okay. So I've had a couple of questions come in through my membership, just through random emails. And the question is, and I'll just put it in a nutshell, says, can we add this to our medical records? And it says something like, please note that this dictation was completed with computer voice recognition software. Unanticipated grammatical, syntax, homophones, and other interpretive errors are inadvertently transcribed by the computer. Disregard these errors, and they're not our fault. Or dictated but not read. And somebody asked me, they said, so is this good enough to limit the provider's liability? And I said, no, actually it increases it. You're basically saying that I signed off on a note and I don't care to read it and make sure that it's okay. A lot of the Medicare providers, MAC carriers, have put out published guidance regarding this and said, first of all, I'll have to say what WPS said. They said that it's a new trend. I think it's an old trend. I know all of us that have been seeing this. I'm still seeing it in my auditing. And it says, in medical record documentation using some types of disclaimer. They're saying examples due to possible errors. There may be errors in the documentation. There may be misspelled words. There may be inadvertent, incorrect prescriptions. Oh my gosh. And it said, and they emphasize this in their guidance, and they underline it, said, providers are responsible for the medical record documentation, end stop. Disclaimers such as those above do not remove that responsibility. Before you attach your signature, we expect the information is complete and accurate. And I just want to say one more thing before I put it out to the panel, because I went and I have a lot of attorneys, I know a lot of people do, that talk about this. But I said, I need to get both sides. So I went and contacted a couple of my friends that are both either defense or plaintiff attorneys. And I said, what do you think about this? So defense attorneys said they don't want the disclaimer anywhere on the note. They don't want it in the record. They don't want it in the note. They don't want to know that you've even considered using it. They said if it's been in there in the last 10 years, somebody will find it. It's kind of like that Facebook picture that you don't want anybody to know about. They said, and they'll use it against you. The plaintiff attorneys that I contacted, like, oh, yes, I love it. Who has it? I'll open a case right now. I'm like, oh, shoot. They said they will rip the author a new one. That's how they put it. That's what they said it to me. They said they'll rip them to shreds, even if no errors were found in the note. And they said because it just loses the credibility to the provider all at once. So disclaimers, Sean and I talk about this every once in a while. I know we're going to mention it when we talk on Terry Tuesday tomorrow, but you can't get around something. You can't figure out how to get around it. And, I'll throw it back to Paul first and Scott for some feedback on this. But Paul, I mean, I know you've been doing this for 100 years like me, and especially in the auditing. Look at him. He's like, I can't wait to unpack this statement. What do you see? And you agree, right? This is ridiculous.
Let me take you back to the golden year of 2008.
where mortgages were collapsing, and the gray hair count on my head was 2. And the son who's about to graduate high school in 3 weeks was also 2. I had a meeting with a neurologist who used Dragon dictation into Epic, as one would in 2008 in Wisconsin, because everybody had Epic first year. And I'm reviewing his notes for the assessment and plan, and the diagnosis that he had in his note that was signed and that was authenticated was diabetic performed a rock with you. Actually, that was diabetic polyneuropathy, but he signed off on it anyway. And that was at the point in my professional development when I said, can you please review your notes before you attach a signature, as WPS so aptly put it, and make certain that this is a document that's useful. I mean, nobody gets to write professional driver on closed course do not attempt on the bottom of their doctor's notes. That's for commercials where you're driving an SUV with 4x4. This is medical documentation. You practice defensive medicine in every other way possible. Christine had a really good example of insane defensive medicine this morning in our email chain. Why are you going through a whole battery of testing and a whole battery of defensive measures as a practicing provider, and then putting out documentation into the world that isn't worth the paper it's written on? Makes no sense whatsoever.
Right. And Scott, your take on this, because I know you and I have even talked about this. Scott, this doesn't sound right, does it?
I mean, it's hard to add substantively to even what Paul said, right? It's ridiculous. And the things that we see in medical notes, like the clear errors, incorrect medication names, like some medicine that I can't recognize the name of in the dictation, I can't. There's contradictory information. The patient's name is wrong, and frankly, some of that stuff, if the patient is like misgendered, right? Like in some ways, you'd think, well, that's on the list of errors, like fairly innocuous. But imagine when the patient reads the note, right? And so I just think you can't, as everyone has said, you can't disclaim your way out of accurate medical record documentation and then just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, well, what can you do, right? Like I said it could be wrong. When the note goes out to a specialist and the specialist reads the incorrect medication or something like that, what's the risk at that point?
Well, and when the pharmacy reads it, we had
Right.
I had a recent request to be part of a deposition and lawsuit, and I ran so far away from this. I was like, "You've got to be kidding me! No, thank you." Where it was just like this. There was a disclaimer in the note, and the note had a prescription where the doctor said that it should have had for the milligrams a decimal point put in, and it wasn't put in. And so the patient was given 10 times the amount versus what the doctor wanted them to have. Patient ended up at the hospital, slip and fell from dizziness, whatever. Patient was, I think 92 years old and had a slight dementia. And the doctor then not only had to, after he freaked out a little bit, had to basically talk to the patient and apologize. But he tried to blame it on everything but him just not proofreading what was in the note. And I think if he just apologized to the patient, said, absolutely my fault, I should have made sure that would have been one thing. But to say, well, what happens in electronic medical records to a 92-year-old patient? They don't care. They just know that they're in the hospital because there was an error made and you're responsible.
Well, and I don't know that many people are going to care in that situation,
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
There's just so much downstream risk. Like you're relying on all of these other people essentially to do your own cleanup, right? Like that's, you're sort of saying, well, the pharmacist should catch this, or somebody else should catch this, and it's you as the rendering provider. It's your signature.
Well, and Sean, to you that does a lot of legal work. It seems like people don't seem to realize that when you're documenting in the medical record, it's not just for yourself. It's for other people that are taking a lot of the information and expecting you to be the expert, and then running with it, whether it be prescriptions, medications, treatments, whatever. And it's kind of a domino effect. If it starts out bad, it's going to continue almost like billing, coding, like anything. How does a doctor even defend themselves when they put in a disclaimer like that? Is there any defense to it that you've seen?
Well, so I don't think laziness is defensible. But what I would say is, to mitigate these types of issues, providers need to review and sign off on all their dictated notes before they're finalized. It ensures accuracy, compliance, accountability in the patient documentation. And, and really, I look to organizations that employ the providers to do their job, which is to provide training and support to help the physicians efficiently manage their documentation responsibilities without compromising the patient care. So, I was thinking about this, and in my mind, one of the first things that came to mind, and I shared this with the panel before we got started, was, something that I refer to as DBNR, right? Dictated but not read, DBNR. And basically, it indicates that the physician dictated the note or report, but didn't review it for accuracy before it was finalized and distributed. So while we look at it and we think to ourselves DBNR may be convenient, it raises a lot of concerns, right? Like, the first thing that comes to mind for me is accuracy. Without reviewing the dictated note, there's a risk of inaccuracies, omissions, or errors. Again, this compromises the quality of patient documentation and can lead to misinterpretations or adverse patient outcomes. I think you look at it, from a legal, excuse me, and regulatory perspective, right? Healthcare documentation has to adhere to legal and regulatory standards, such as those set forth by the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. 2 A's, not 2 P's.
Right. And I think look at our
Yeah,
panel comments from people. I think one's funny, Cairo Medicare. I
yeah,
always laugh when they comment, said, why didn't the doctor just put in there, I'm too lazy to read my notes?
yeah.
But I agree with the one comment. If the doctor spent as much time trying to comply with regulations as they did try to get around something, we may be better off. But I think this is just like when you find, false claims and things like that, and they say, well, my billers did it, or my coders did it, or, again, trying to get around this thing. And, that's why Pam, she's like, it'd be better to have paper charts sometimes, because again, this voice activated software, the AI, the assist electronically, I think people are trying to say that should be perfect. And if it isn't, don't blame me.
Well, let me give a couple of let me give a few other things that are on the top of my head very quickly that I want people to think about, and then I'll take these 5 or 6 things that are in my brain, and I will put them onto a blog a little bit later on. But patient safety. Terry, you brought this up. Remember, clinicians rely on accurate patient records for clinical decision making, for continuity of care, and communication with other healthcare providers. Somebody brought up liability. Remember, it's the physician who bears the legal responsibility for the content of the medical record. So by disclaiming responsibility through something like a DBNR, physicians may not adequately protect themselves from liability in the event of errors or malpractice claims. Reimbursement. This is a huge one to think about, right? Incomplete or inaccurate documentation can affect reimbursement and revenue cycle management. Insufficient documentation can lead to claim denials, delayed payments, or audits by the payers. And finally, the last one, to our good friend Cairo Medicare, professionalism. This could be perceived as a lack of accountability or diligence in patient care. It may undermine trust between patients and healthcare providers if patients become aware of disclaimers indicating that their medical records were not actually reviewed by their providers, who were the ones who actually created the documentation in the first place. So I think it's critical that, providers understand that, cutting corners, taking shortcuts could be detrimental to not only their reputation, but to their pocket.
Well, and imagine, I think you're laying it out very starkly, right? Like imagine being in court, like on the stand, essentially conceding that you have no idea what's in your own patient's medical record.
Yeah, I dictated it, but I have no idea what's in there because I didn't read it.
Yeah.
Seriously? I mean, I'm in, I just got done wrapping up a malpractice case. I don't do a lot of malpractice cases for a lot of reasons, but I just got done wrapping one up, and I will tell you, it comes down to, and this is the God's honest truth. If it were not for the fact that this clinician dotted every I and crossed every T and was so personally aware of everything that goes on in her patient's clinical care, this person would have absolutely been decimated during this trial. But because she was diligent, because her documentation was so good, and because we were able to rely on the metadata to be able to show us the audit trail of everything that was entered, when it was entered, who entered it, what was adjusted, what was changed, all of these things, this was the saving grace. All right. So I think we have thoroughly talked about disclaimers, maybe even a little bit beyond, Terry, what you actually thought we were going to talk about, because you were like, oh, our big topic of the day is this other thing. So let's just talk about disclaimers first. But heck, we've spent 17 minutes talking about disclaimers.
Don't do it.
Yeah, don't do it. We could have just saved everybody's time and go, don't do it. It's like the incident 2 comment. Don't do it. All right. So, Paul Spencer, you've got an interesting couple of topics. You were at a retreat not too long ago, and at the tail end of the presentation, something interesting came up. So let's talk about that.
Yes. So I attended this year's spring meeting of the Ortho Forum. I'd like to thank the Ortho Forum for having me as a speaker in quasi lovely downtown Indianapolis. And I'd like to thank the streets of Indianapolis for taking one of my hubcaps while I was there. But while I was at the meeting, we were talking a little bit about different issues that come up in orthopedic offices. And one person who was in the session brought up the fact that they are having a tough time finding a certified coder with requisite experience in their area to be able to work in their practice. They lost an experienced coder based on what we're dealing with in an inflationary cycle right now in the U.S. economy, and people trying to squeeze out every single dollar that they can in their employment. And it's becoming harder and harder to find experienced coders. Now, I've been it'll be next month that I'll be a certified coder now for 26 years. By no means am I the greatest coder since sliced bread, but I do have some concerns about what follows our generation into the coding arena. And what it led to was a very healthy discussion of trying to find someone within your practice or someone out, even closely associated with your practice who is looking for a career in coding and trying to do it on a one-to-one level rather than just saying, go to the AAPC website, and just brushing them off. Because more and more, I don't think that is going to be a solution, specifically with the AAPC being so focused on building an offshore coding apparatus right now. It's going to take an individual effort on the part of every single small practice, particularly those in areas that are not particularly served by a wide population of certified coders, to identify those people who are looking for a career rather than simply a job that pays well. And I'm thankful for the conversation, because I have a feeling that it's a fear that a lot of practices have out there, and a lot of large groups have as well, as slowly, a population boom that occurred between 1946 and 1964 starts to transition out of employment, and what that looks like on the other side of that with a coder population that may not have the skill set to be able to do that, particularly for something like orthopedic surgery, which takes a lot of time and a lot of experience in order to go through.
Paul, something that you brought up, I think some people also miss it a little bit, and I'll ask the panel, I know Stephanie might deal with this, and Scott and Christine. I deal with a lot of, and I'm going to air quote, coders that aren't certified, and they're very good. That it just not certification is a personal stepping stone, if you will. Yes, a lot of practices, a lot of employers require it as a way to say, okay, well, that person does their job and everything, and they can pass a test. But I've also seen certified coders, and I'm like, faceplant, I can't believe they're actually saying they're an expert in this. But I think that's one thing that you have to be really cognitive of, for everybody who's listening to the podcast or watching. There's people in your staff, there's people out there that aren't necessarily test takers, but are very fast learners, very quick learners, can take the information, and they want to be there. And you'd be surprised, taking people out of retail workforce, not to demean it, because we need them, fast food workforce or whatever they're in, and just to make a change maybe into healthcare. You'd be surprised how many of those people are quality people in healthcare that can actually do the job. Yeah. And so I know, Christine, you want to jump in on this, but I feel like sometimes there's a missed opportunity, and people default maybe to, well, I'm going to bring in my sister-in-law, or I'm going to bring in my wife, or I'm going to be, and they're coming in because they have to, not because they want to be there. And you want people who want to be there, who want to, try and build maybe a different career, a different path for themselves from an employment standpoint. And so don't close off people that just because they may not have a certification. We see on LinkedIn all the time, people are like, I'm still studying for my exam. I'm having trouble with it, but I'm a really good coder. I can break down everything. It's just the exam I'm having trouble with.
Well, I wanted to take it one step further, Terry. A lot of small practices, and we still have small practices in the country. A lot of those small practices, they cannot afford to have a separate coder and a separate biller, or maybe they just don't have the volume to support two separate positions. And oftentimes those two positions get blurred. And it's important to know that coders are trained to read documentation and apply the translation in the code sets that we use. But the billers really have that responsibility of learning the art of billing and working specifically with the different payers, the structure that the payers require, the policies that vary amongst payers. I mean, even look at the MACs. Even the MACs have different recommendations. So investing. Now, my organization, we do teach a billing course, and that's not what I want to talk about. But I think a lot of people don't get that fundamental education that's necessary. They don't know what an NCCI is. They don't know what MUEs are. They don't know those types of things. And I think it's important that we encourage that practices, small practices, you encourage your people to get that knowledge, to get that training. They're just going to bring it back to your office. They're just going to use it to make you, your finances, your business of medicine stronger, right? So that's what I wanted to add as well into that. Not just focusing on having a good coder, but also making sure that you've invested into those people that are transmitting these claims on your behalf, that are working with the payers to get that reimbursement for the practice.
Well, I'll say this, one of the 7 elements of a compliance program is training and education.
Right.
And you can't demonstrate a culture of compliance in your organization by omitting what I consider to be the most important aspect, which is training and education of your staff and your providers. I hear a lot of time, God, and I just said, that frustrates me more than anything. So when I hear a client say to me, revenues are down right now and I don't have the, finances to spend money on sending my staff to training and education, I tell them that's precisely when you need to be sending your staff for training and education. When your revenue cycle is disrupted, when your revenues are down and you can't point to a single reason why, there could be a culmination of things going on. It could be denials. It could be lack of understanding for what the requirements of the CPT codes are, misappropriation of diagnosis codes or misapplication of diagnosis codes, unbundling of services. If you have brought somebody into your organization, you know, your first cousin's nephew's son's uncle's brother's daughter's good friend, Vinny, and
That guy.
you know, and you brought that individual into that baby who has your hubcap. That individual is the person who you are now relying on to get all of this stuff done, but they have no requisite skills. You kind of get what you ask for. I mean, you know, you don't take your car to Taco Bell for an oil change. You take it to a mechanic. You don't hire my cousin Vinny to do your coding and billing. You hire somebody that has the foundation, the requisite skills to be able to do the right things at the right times. So,
well, I know Scott wants to chime in.
Would you have your cousin come in and do your taxes for you if well, you know,
I did that once and I got audited for the next 3 years after.
Right. They worked at a Holiday Inn once. So sure, they can do my taxes. We would never think of things like that. No. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, the thing I was going to add to this, what I think is a very good conversation is, you know, professional development is important to people. Having a career path is important to people. And, you know, these things that we talk about, you know, when you invest in somebody in the way that we're talking about here, it really helps spur more loyalty, and that can make a difference. So, you know, one of the things that I hear a lot when I'm kind of out and about, especially working with smaller practices, is sometimes I'll hear, well, you know, the insert name of large health system or university health system, they just take everybody like anyway, right? And there's a part of that where it's like you can't necessarily get into a bidding war over talent because you're just not going to win. But there's a lot more to building work relationships than money. And, you know, for everybody, money's not necessarily the sole factor in how they make their professional decisions. So it certainly is very important, obviously. But, you know, having a staff that feels, you know, valued, rewarded, invested in, built up, developed, those are all, I think, important factors when we have these conversations. Because, you know, when you lose somebody, the cost of replacement, you know, the risk of hiring somebody that doesn't work out, those things are very high. Like, one of the things I always say with hiring is, if I had the secret sauce to hire the right person every time, like, that's the line of work I'd be in, because you know, there's such a value to being able to acquire talent. And I think those are important things to consider as well.
Well, I think also too, people, I think Pam's saying it, and I know Teresa said it. I think you also, for the listeners, you need to invest in yourself. I mean, you never stop learning. I'm a perfect example. I know Paul said that he's been a certified coder for 26 years. I got certified, my very first one, in 1992. And folks, let me tell you when that was. That was when they sent your certification in the mail and told you in the window envelope, if it says CPC, you passed. If it doesn't, you didn't. So I got an envelope that said no CPC. So I threw it in a drawer, cried for days. And then we get a second letter a month later saying, oh, sorry, we had a glitch. We didn't have it print in the window. So I went back and opened it. I found it in my junk drawer. Guess what? I passed, and I passed with high. I passed with a 90, and you had a 70%. So I was so mad. But the point is that was a long time ago, and all of us have alphabet soup after our name. I know I've got 14 credentials, but I started getting really interested in prior authorization, and that goes along with coding and billing and all of that. So doing a lot of research, there's now a certification for it. I did the independent study program. I absolutely passed it, and it was so interesting. And there was things I knew and things I was like, really? Wow. And it goes back to what we were talking about with disclaimers and bad documentation on things you need for prior authorization. But just bringing it forward, you can never stop learning. I don't care if you've been in it I'm in my 40th year of healthcare. You just can't stop learning. And as much as I'd like to say it's on the employers to invest in people, it's also on yourself. So you really need to continue in that practice, even if it's not getting another certification, but just to continue to read your guidance, read the documentation. There's so much change. And I know Christine and I pulled our hair out during the pandemic because every week we would call each other and go, did you see the change in telehealth? Yeah, I know what it said last week, but this week it says this, and it was just like, oh my gosh, I sent Scott something, I think a year into the pandemic. And I'm like, Scott, does this make sense? He goes, well, if you're a little house in the prairie doctor, I'll never forget that. But it's just funny to me because without continually updating yourself and knowing what's current, I mean, Sean and I have conversations about supervision and those things and temporary things versus permanent and Federal Register versus payer guidelines. So, again, on the topic, just make sure as a staff member, if you want to have some value, just make sure that you're also continually to learn, continually to update yourself with authoritative resources. That I want to put that in there. Sometimes we get emails from people that say, well, I read it in this book, and I won't name names because we know what good publications are and what terrible ones are. And they say they read it on Facebook, so it must be accurate. And you're just like, oh my gosh. So make sure.
And I just want to add in here too. So kind of the opposite perspective there from what you're saying, Terry. Not that people should not invest in themselves because that's very necessary. But one of the things I've been struggling with when I'm working with clients this year that are in trouble. So, Sean's called in, we're going through the attorney. There's people that don't even know in general what the coding rules are, but they also see no value in having someone who has coding knowledge in their practice. So, a lot of times, like for example, with a rheumatology practice we worked with recently, their infusions are completely messed up. And it's like, if that is your specialty, that's your practice, that's a lot of money. How do you even know if you're doing it right or wrong if you've never done audits in the past? You don't see the value in having trained staff. You don't have the ability yourself to offer support and education. So how's that going to work out if you just bring somebody in? To Paul's point, you have to be ready to train people up and have the knowledge. And I think the biggest thing is in the employer's part and on the employee's part, it's never going to be hands off. So there needs to be work from both sides of that when it comes to education and figuring out where you lie within that scale of compliance.
Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah.
Well, this all good points made by the panel. I think when I first became a certified coder, I think one thing that we learned very quickly, probably within the first 1 to 5 days of our employment, was that there's coding theory and then there's coding practice. And that goes to a lot of what Terry and Christine were talking about with regard to, just having that billing knowledge and that hands-on knowledge of how to submit a clean claim the first time and get it out the door, because that is the goal, is creating that clean claim. It's not about, determining what the perfect code is for this scenario that went on for 2 pages on a test that you took one Saturday for 5 hours. It goes much deeper than that. And yes, your billers might have that logic, but they just see themselves in this little basket. And especially if you're a specialist and you have somebody like that on your staff, that is somebody that needs to be cultivated and needs to be moved up. And, to Terry's point, I did work with some very experienced coders over the period of my occupational life that were never certified, but because they were locked into one specialty, they knew it inside and out. Now, it does, it would cause problems if they moved outside that specialty, but they found that, that was the lane that they wanted to stay in, and that served them well. And particularly when you're in a low population area where you don't have your pick of coders, that's certainly something to take into account.
Yeah, I think these are all great points. And, the one thing that I also remind folks a lot, because over my career, I've had an opportunity to work with folks who were not certified as coders or auditors, and they were solid. Their work was outstanding. And then I've had an opportunity to work with some folks who had multiple certifications after their name, and I don't think they could code their way out of a CPT book. So I remind people all the time, and this is one of the things that I did over my career, which is when I was looking to hire individuals as coders or auditors, we had them take a test. We had them take a practical test where it was an actual note, and it wasn't multiple choice where you read, retained, and regurgitated. You literally had to take a note, you had to dissect it, you had to determine what the proper CPT code or codes were, you had to determine what the proper diagnosis code or codes were, you had to rank them and sequence them. If there were applicable modifiers, you had to append the modifiers. So this was not a test. This was take this actual documentation and create a claim that would go to an insurance company for processing and remuneration. And that, to me, is the difference between theory and practical application. So,
Sean, I'm starting to see offices saying they're going to wipe out their coding staff for AI, and I'm like, it's not ready. It's not ready. There's oversight has just started. They're doing it.
yeah,
They're backwards, and
Yeah.
it scares me because
yeah.
of all the bias stuff.
I think there are certain areas and certain industries where you can use AI efficiently and effectively. I do not believe in the world of coding, billing, and documentation that human beings will be replaced anytime soon by an AI. Now, I know there's arguments about machine learning, and the more repetition it gets, the more information you feed it, the smarter it becomes, the more logic it's able to build. But I go back to like Chat GPT for physicians who put in a medical condition and they get this 15-page breakdown of the condition, and it creates a document for them, right? Their documentation. But when you read it, it's got all of these cited sources. But when you start citing the sources, they're wrong. And it doesn't make any, and let me ask you this, okay? Let me ask you this, and Christine, I want to come to you for some thoughts. If I create a document for a patient with coronary artery disease, and I use that coronary artery disease Chat GPT generated documentation for every single patient with CAD, do I have cloning? Is that now a new regulatory risk that I face?
Yeah, there's an
Although,
EMR system out there right now that causes this issue
although I
constantly.
mean,
Yeah.
I work with enough providers who are doing the 5 cent version of that, where they just copy and paste whatever is like the diabetes instructions are, and they're always the same, right? And it's it's always like the dietary advice is the same. So I think there's some of that going on already. But I mean, I agree. It gives the appearance of cloning, and I think it really, similar to some of the other topics we've talked about, it disregards the specific medical conditions of individual patients and how they are different.
Well, how about, Scott, when you see in the record it says this patient is high risk because, and then you read verbatim what it says high risk is on the grid from AMA.
Yeah.
And you're just like, no, that's a learning tool. That's not this patient. I saw one that said, we did prescription drug management on this patient. Therefore, this is a moderate visit. There's
Yeah.
no prescriptions there's no prescriptions given to this patient or management. So
I mean, I see that all the time where, and it's the response when I get asked about these coding tools that exist now, right? Where it's really just, it's just going to spit out to you however you define these terms. So if you say that the patient is high risk from a treatment perspective, you have to be able to define that in accordance with the guidelines and not just say it. And I think that's some of the challenges that we run into that are only going to be exacerbated by some of the AI tools, right? It's you really have to specifically say like what it is that you're doing.
That's where I was going with it. I think what I want to say is just the short version of, we haven't been able to figure out good documentation with the use of the EMR, with the natural learning platform, with the smart computers already. What makes us think that if we kick that up a notch and we hand it over to AI, who is going to be basing those notes on the bad notes that we've already created, what makes us think in a world that this is going to get any better? Like you were saying, Terry, I still see the comment on the bottom. This is a high risk patient. Well, they came in for a splinter. So explain that to me, right? Or I spent 90 to 188 minutes with this patient doing counseling and coordination of care. Was it 90? Was it 188 minutes? Like I already see junk. So we're
Yeah.
going to use junk to make AI?
Right.
Hey,
Or they take time,
a splinter in your finger, a splinter in your finger is within 4 feet of your heart.
Well, I'm not a doctor, but
You
if
know.
I'm paying the bill.
Well, that
somebody's
depends on
gonna
how
pay that.
long your arms are.
I like when they
Also
say
true.
well, the patient was either seen by the physician or the nurse practitioner. I'm like, which was it? Can you be more specific?
Slash
Yeah.
deny.
I think the key I think the key takeaway to what we're talking about here is there's no substitute at this point for strong human interaction with the review of medical records to ensure proper coding, documentation, billing, and remuneration for the services rendered. I think that's the key takeaway.
Well, I'll just leave it with this. I mean, we struggle with basic information, finding a trusted source. The trusted source to your patient is you. You have to create that documentation. You know, is it the guy who just throws out a lot of stuff on the internet and ChatGPT is drawing from that and creating documentation for your unique patient from that source? Or should you be creating that? I would argue it's the latter.
Agreed 100%. All right. Takes us to our last topic of the day. And I think this is a very interesting one. The use of diabetic medications for weight loss for individuals that don't have diabetes. Now, I will tell you, and I'm not trying to get into a debate or an argument as to whether it works or it doesn't work or the successes or whatever it is. I know many individuals who are taking one of these versions of an injectable, Januvia, Wanuvia, whatever they're all called. Okay. And I've seen tremendous outcomes from people that have been taking it. Congratulations. I think it's wonderful if that's what you were setting out to do. But if you as a clinician are going to prescribe these drugs for the patients coming to you, it has to be medically necessary. And there are requirements that the payers have put forth to ensure that the coverage of said injectables is medically necessary. So, Stephanie, let me go to you because I know you had a situation not too long ago where you had a practice that was using this on every single patient pretty much that was coming in, and the documentation was atrocious.
Yeah. So a couple of things, and I kind of have a lot on this, but I want to lay the groundwork for it. And I think this is a good platform to start talking about it on, because this is something where, if you're listening, don't think of this only in a weight loss clinic. I first saw this in a family practice. I second saw this in rheumatology, and last week finished up with a weight loss clinic, which had all kinds of issues. So one other thing that I want to just preface this with as well, it is beyond just the diabetic drugs now that I'm seeing. So last week when I was finishing up with the weight clinic, they were using a depression medication for weight loss. They were also using an anti-seizure medication for weight loss. So when we look to this entire subject, I know in the past that I've brought up, last year or whenever, the whole subject about how we have to be careful when your providers come back and want to use new devices and machines. So if you remember, we talked a lot about FDA approval, what that looks like, how it plays into everything with the payers. That is the same exact thing over here when we're talking about drugs and medication. So years ago, we started to see these issues when providers were starting to use ketamine to infuse for depression. That was considered, you may hear your practitioners calling this off-label treatment. But we saw that issue back then, but now when it comes to the weight loss side of things, I'm just seeing this all over the place. So when we talk about medical necessity and payer policy, you have to actually go to the FDA and look at FDA's approval. So, for example, I'll use the drug Wellbutrin. Last week, as I'm auditing, that's the weight loss drug that I saw. You can go to the FDA website and see that that is not approved for weight loss purposes. Now, when we are dealing with the drugs that are approved for weight loss, you'll also see that there are some restrictions there, again from the FDA. So the patient has to be, I think it's at 30 or over BMI, or they can be 27 or higher if they have a weight related condition, chronic condition, which they just give a real small sample of what that is. Diabetes is there, hypertension is there. We don't have an all encompassing list, but when we think to documentation and what Sean was saying about the way that the notes are that I'm looking at, we don't even have the practitioners tying in any chronic conditions. They're just saying, oh, the patient's on the drug, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And it's just been all over the place. Now, one other thing that I just want to cover that I was personally surprised by last week when I was working with the weight loss clinic. They are a bariatric surgery center. And I was looking at patients who were in their postoperative period already being prescribed medications. So, of course, my mind went over that line. I know we're not clinical. I do not apply clinical knowledge in any way. I don't have it. I don't claim to have it. But the first thing I thought of to myself is, we've got to find out from the physicians what clinical information they have that they're giving this drug after surgery. Because if you remember years ago, it took forever for those bariatric surgeries to be approved and covered. And now what we're finding after all of these years of those surgeries happening, a lot of the patients don't continue, what they need to be doing personally to keep the weight off. So if they have to go through the motions of one psychiatric visit, 2 or 3 visits with a dietitian or whatever it may be, then the outcome is they're gaining the weight back. How do the drugs fit into this? Like, I'm just really confused by that. I'm really curious to see what the payers do with that in the future. The patients do have, at that point, their BMI is really high after surgery, so they would qualify for the drug. But how do you know if the surgery even worked if you're already injecting them with drugs? I don't know. It's just all over the place. Now, one last thing that I forgot that we have to talk about. This has to be self-pay. if your providers want to do this, you have to implement self-pay processes. This has been very difficult for some of our clients to hear that we've been working with this, because they already have these patients who are receiving the medications. Sean, to some extent, I know in some of the cases we've worked in the past, they're going to have to make sure they're also not medically abandoning a patient when they're now going to have to switch, and they should be going back and refunding everything they shouldn't have billed to begin with. But, this is very problematic. It's not just that, this is a new service, we're going to offer it. And, the one physician that I have, he's problematic in general, but his response was, well, I talked to the patients about diet and exercise. And I said to him, I said, you mean the macro statement that says the same thing for every patient? And I said, no, we're not going to get around this. If you're giving them the drug, that has to be self-pay. Okay. Who wants to take it next?
Well, I've seen the same thing, Stephanie, except just in a most recent audit that I was doing, the provider has a weight loss clinic that they're offering those drugs, the Mounjaro, the Wegovy, the Trulicity, the Ozempic. But then they're putting in some other medical diagnosis as the primary diagnosis to bypass the benefit edits that the payers have, that they're not covering weight loss for these medications. And I'm going back to the providers and I'm telling them the chief complaint is weight loss. The HPI is weight loss. The physical exam is weight loss. And then suddenly at the very bottom, I'm seeing hypertension. Wait a minute. So we need to remember that from a payer's perspective, if they don't cover that benefit, you can't monkey the diagnosis to get it paid.
Yeah.
Well, how many of you are seeing the prediabetes?
Yeah.
They're putting that in there, and I'm just like, no, you can't do that unless it's justified. Or I have providers saying, and then Paul, I know you want to chime in. They say something like, well, what diagnosis will get it paid? And I'm muting now.
Well, again, everything circles back to assessment plan and an evaluation and management service. What are you actively managing? You're managing the patient's weight loss regimen. So the diagnosis is weight loss. It is not hypertension. It is not any of the other things that might be contributing to the patient's need for weight loss. It is weight loss, and everything else is in the hands of the primary carrier. Just had an audit dealing with this. We still have an audit dealing with this. Had a talk with a carrier just last week.
But do you hear what we're saying? We've all recently had audits on this topic. So we're sharing this with you. But if there is 6 people across the country who have been actively working these audits, there are so many more out there that are actively working these audits. This is great advice, friends.
Yeah, so I just want to throw out there too, I forgot to give some tips on how to actually research each individual drug. So you can go into Google and, type in the name of the drug and FDA. But if you more specifically want to see the labeling, you can go into the drug manufacturer's websites and they will have links in there. Typically, it'll be referred to as information for the providers. You can go in there, take a look, and usually there is a PDF of that drug labeling, and it'll spell everything out in there, what the indications are and how it's covered, how they're supposed to be prescribing it as well, the dose and all of that.
How many of you are getting the question that happens all the time that says, how do I get this paid by insurance? For me, it should be full stop as how is this paid? Whether it be patient, cash pay, or by insurance. But it's always, how do I get this paid by insurance? Like, how do I get around the system? And it's frustrating.
Yeah. As I've listened to the discussion, I think what I'm taking away from this is, irrespective of whether or not there are payers reimbursing for the use of these drugs for weight loss, I think the smartest approach, until we have more definitive guidance, until we have more, areas that we can give authoritative guidance, right, from the payors, I think it's wise that practices use this as a self-pay service. I don't know that the
But wait,
juice
Sean,
is worth the squeeze.
I haven't had a problem finding these policies. Aetna, United Healthcare, Cigna, where they say we don't cover weight loss.
Right, but
I
what
haven't had
I'm
a problem finding them.
no. I
Oh.
hear what you're saying. I'm with you 100%. It's the folks that are not searching for the policies that are saying, well, my doctor's friend who's an OB-GYN down the street is doing this, and he told my doctor or she told my doctor that they're getting paid for this stuff with no problem. Listen, it may not be a problem today, but it may be a huge problem tomorrow.
I have a
So-
dentist that wants to know how to get paid for it.
You're killing me.
I know.
But you're just a
totally do.
dentist.
But
I
that's the other thing we got to remind those doctors, and I remind mine quite often. When somebody gets in trouble with the OIG, they're on a CIA, they don't put out a news flash. They don't call the local news and say, hey, I got in trouble. Come do a story on me so that everybody knows what kind of trouble I got into. They never say that. So why would you just blindly say, well, Dr. So-and-so down the street does it. He says he's getting paid. How do you know that he's not also paying it back now?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I also have physicians who were shocked that if the FDA, like the whole approval thing, is not there for the drug, they couldn't believe that they could not be reimbursed for the E&M service. They didn't understand how it's all linked together.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, and that's why I was saying in the beginning, and like Sean said, that is the base of medical necessity.
Yeah.
So if it's not there, no services, not just the drug, no E&M, no nothing.
I look at this situation in the exact same way I look at the amniotic fluid. It is not medically necessary according to the payors, and as a result, any and all services rendered in conjunction with the injection of an amniotic fluid is not reimbursable because the drug is considered to be experimental and or investigational, which means all of those services are prohibited.
But
All
Sean,
right.
can't we bill it as something else and pretend that it was the drug?
Sure, you can bill it as whatever you want. Just be prepared that when the little nice men and women in the blue coats with yellow letters on the back start knocking on your door after they've crime scene taped off your area at 7:45 in the morning as your patients are pulling into the parking lot, just remember, you billed it as something other than what it actually was.
But
and I
there
think
was a
that-
code for it. Doesn't that automatically convey coverage?
Right.
I mean, I think that last point is the best one, because the more you start to go down that path of, if I find this diagnosis, or if there's a point between acknowledging that it's a self-pay service or a not covered benefit and trying to manipulate it into being a covered service, and that's the difference between repaying something versus potentially having like a criminal exposure, frankly. So I think that's an important thing to remember when you're starting to go through those gymnastics of shoehorning something into a payable circumstance.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's going to bring us to the end of this week's Auditing, Coding, and Compliance Roundtable on the Compliance Guy. I want to thank Stephanie, Paul, Terry, Christine, and Scott in no particular order for being here today and for taking time out of their very busy schedules. Terry and I are going to be back tomorrow with a hashtag Terry episode. I'm looking forward to doing that one with her. It's always entertaining. The panel will be back in 2 weeks. So until then, be good to yourself, but more importantly, y'all be good to each other. Take care.